What are the effects of majority rule on democracy in the United States? By Taylor Whale. Democracy is commonly associated with equality and freedom. In American democracy, we can observe majority rule, which could possibly contradict these two common factors that were envisioned to be a result of democracy by founders. American democracy is conceded to be an example of a free society, but is this the entire truth? This research will focus on majority rule and the effect that this form of rule by the people has on democracy. Majority rule plays an important role in American democracy. However, under this context, the American society is free to the extent that the majority is not frustrated with the government. The founders of the United States Constitution attempted to protect the American society against the majority. That is, they understood that a democracy based upon equal representation would not prioritize the majority. The founders experienced the tyrannical nature of monarchs, resulting in intentions that ruled out a majoritarian tyranny that would effectively replace a monarch. They fought for individual liberty that, in return, created anti-majoritarian institutions. One example of this type of institution would be the Senate. The founders intended the Senate to be an appointment of a senator by the legislators of each state. This, however, was amended to be an election by voters. Additionally, the Constitution declared that the office of presidency would be selected by the legislator of each state in an attempt to insulate this office from popular will. Overall, it has been indicated that the democracy that was designed by the Founding Fathers differs from what the average American today understands democracy to be, that being a democracy in which the majority opinion has a direct and unfettered rule. Majority decision at the polls may be an effective form of choosing political personnel, but it presumably violates the freedom of the minority. It is important to consider that the majority has the power to do this. However, they do not have the right. After all, majority support does not have the ability to determine rightness because the right thing depends on the decision that each individual is inherently able to decide for themselves. The founders held high regard for individual citizens through their beliefs that each individual had the inherent rights, intending the function of government to respect and protect those rights. Skepticism towards the very existence of natural law led to sanctioning of political might. The sanction resulted in majoritarianism, which in return caused lawmakers to secure the individual liberty our Constitution promises, with various checks on majority action. The inclusion of these checks derived from the conviction of the inherent rights of every man. The definition of democracy effectively fails to explain what constitutes as the people who have supreme power over their government. In practice, it is clear that the democracy is governed by the majority. This is exampled through the majority's ability to decide an election of issues through the process of voting. Thus, when stated that the people have spoken, there is a general understanding that the majority is the persisting voice. Majority rule establishes several functions for democracy, one being that it provides a clear mechanism for decision-making. The founders considered majority rule a troubling conundrum. On one hand, it was necessary for expressing popular view and provided a basis for establishing the republic. Considering the inevitability that someone will disagree on an issue, consensus has no ability to create a basis for political or legislative decisions. Unfortunately, minority rule would be antithetical to democracy because it ignores the majority belief. Democracy is intended to consider minority rights as equally as it does with majority rights. The innumerate rights that are outlined in the Bill of Rights may not be violated by the government, which safeguards, in theory, against a majority tyranny. On that note, majority and minority beliefs can easily collide. This can be maintained through a consensus respect for the individual rights of all persons in all periods of democracy, meaning in between elections and during political campaigns. The belief that democracy allows power of the people over themselves is not a true statement. In fact, the people who exercise this power are not always the same people by which this power is exercised over. Additionally, the self-government that is perpetuated by the Constitution is not actually self-government. It is the governing of each by the rest. The goal should be personal freedom and liberty for all, regardless of whether or not this goal is logically possible to completely achieve. Some argue that majority rule is fair because it does not allow for some votes to count more or provide privilege for those who agree with the majority. Minorities are guaranteed basic human rights that cannot be taken away by legislation or majority oppression. Minorities are also able to participate in democratic institutions with the same power and same effectiveness as other individual participation. Alexis de Tocqueville accurately predicted our ills as well as our strengths in his book Democracy in America. Tocqueville regarded the then developing nation of the United States as the way of the future. He hoped that America would be an example to the world with a successful combination of equality and liberty for its citizens. While equality can go along with freedom, it can easily go along with despotism as well. Despite his optimism, Tocqueville predicted obstacles that would diminish the freedom of American citizens, although he did not believe those obstacles to be insurmountable. Tocqueville was cautious towards the power of the majority because he believed the majority would break a citizen's will to resist or question its authority and, overall, disregard their ability to think for themselves. He predicted that the majority would silence the minority through an internal conflict of feeling ashamed to disagree. Additionally, Tocqueville feared that the majority opinion would occupy every sphere. He exampled this through his commentary on democratic art, in which he foresaw the majority would not appreciate great human beings doing great deeds. Tocqueville feared that the state would take away citizens' free will. He hoped that his warnings would resonate with those who read his book and allow them to understand the defects in modern democracy. In other words, he hoped that lawmakers would focus on long-term effects towards securing freedom and rights when implementing a policy, instead of considering whether or not said policy will affect themselves and their respective families. Ultimately, Tocqueville hoped that his critiques on democracy would remind us that our nation will not remain strong if every man is weak. The essence of our democracy is majority rule. It seems as though our constitutional democracy requires majority rule with minority rights. Majority rule is endorsed and limited by the supreme law of the Constitution, which protects the rights of individuals. Tyranny of both the minority and the majority is barred in this way. If majority rule were unchecked, it would presumably oppress those holding unpopular views. Thus, unlimited majority rule in a democracy is just as despotic as the unchecked rule of any other democratic institution. In every constitutional democracy, there is tension between the contradictory nature of the majority rule and minority rights. Therefore, it is essential for representatives to decide when and under what conditions should the rule of either the majority or minority be curtailed in order to protect the rights of the other. Of course, this is decided on a case-by-case basis in every respective democracy. It will need to be understood that these curtailments must not be proved permanent or irreparable damage to the rights of the citizens. Essentially, the democratic process of electing representatives has turned into a popularity contest. Voters have begun to support lawmakers that offer the best handouts in the present moment without considering long-term consequences to the nation. In other words, voting has turned into a focus on short-term rewards. The main dilemma here is that the government is unable to offer something to one person without taking something from another. Thus, with more handouts and benefits, more confiscation is required in order to meet obligations to the voters who elected them. The right course of action when dealing with this issue is often unpopular. Unsurprisingly, tough decisions will most likely never be supported by the majority. This is because, while the majority has a lot of influence on democracy, this does not mean that they are morally and ethically the right people to have that power. This research showed that voters tend to be selfishly more concerned about their own immediate benefits than the future they will be handing down to their children and grandchildren. Thus, there is little willingness to make tough decisions in order to save our country. A major important check on majority rule is pluralism. The competition between the two political parties in the United States ensures that viewpoints and ideals are challenged and holds political groups accountable to the citizens. Additionally, it allows for differing viewpoints to be considered in a political or a public forum, regardless of whether they are part of the minority or the majority. Majority rule ensures that a decision is made based on the general welfare of the largest amount of citizenry. In the same respect, democracy needs to ensure that the rights of the minority are protected. If a majority were able to wield their power in an unchecked manner, they would easily be able to tyrannize the minority. Thus, it is a right in our country that the minority has the ability to become a majority through free and fair elections. In this way, it is in the best interest of the majority to protect the minority because the majority-minority binary is capable of reversing. James Madison claimed that it is of great importance in a republic not only to guard the society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of the society against the injustice of the other part. There are protections put in place that create a government devoid of absolute majority power. On a side note, whether these are sustained in practice is a different debate. These protections are a lack of isolation from the minority, free, fair, and regular elections, separation of powers, and checks and balances.